AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I'm delighted to welcome back an old friend. Mike Mears is a friend and former colleague from CIA. Before he retired, he was actually chief of CIA's human resources, and he founded and led CIA's Leadership Academy. He has his undergraduate degree from the Military Academy at West Point, and he has an MBA from Harvard Business School. While in the military, Mike commanded a nuclear missile site and was the aide to a general and was decorated for valor. He lectures and gives talks at a number of organizations, including DoD and a number of the local colleges and universities. He's also written a series of books. He has a brand new book out, which I just read and thoroughly enjoyed. It's entitled Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. Mike, welcome to AFIO Now.
Oh, it's super to be here, Jim. Thank you. I've been looking forward to talking to you.
Mike, what compelled you to write this new book?
Well, I guess this starts out like a bad spy novel, Jim, because I was sitting in my office inside CIA, and I got a phone call from the DDO's office, the Deputy Director of Operations, and they said, come up right away. And you get that little spike of fear of, geez, what have I done now? And so I gave it the old, well, can you tell me a little more about what this is, what it's about? And they said, no, he just said it's very important to get up here. So I went rushing up to his office, and he was sitting at his desk. He looked up at me and he asked me a simple question, but it's one that changed my life. And the question was, Mike, why is it when I pull the levers, nothing happens? And I knew what he meant by levers because I was his chief counselor. What was the title for leadership and management stuff? It's a position that doesn't exist anymore, but I was the go-to person on any questions involving management and leadership stuff. And I couldn't answer the question. And I knew the levers, he meant the communication systems, the training, the reward system, all those levers that executives pull. The reason it struck me is that the DDO before had asked me essentially the same question in a little different way. A fellow named Jack Downing, you may remember that name. And he asked me the question that, why is it I'm in the room and all my direct reports are there and I talk and everybody nods and then everybody leaves the room and nothing happens? So it's essentially the same question. So it started me thinking that with all my training, all my experience, I couldn't answer the most basic question of all, which is why do things not go according to plan? Why is it so hard to change things? Why is it so hard to influence culture and redirect it? All these cascading questions. Anyway, it took me about 4 years, Jim, to figure out the answer is sort of human nature. It's because of how our minds work, how we respond to those various levers and whatnot. So that's the wonderful track I've been on for 19 years now, trying to uncover that and answer the question.
Mike, who was Otzi, and why did you choose him to help tell your story?
Oh boy, you did read the book. This was discovery made in 1993 in the Alps. They found a frozen body of an individual, and they thought it was a old German professor from 100 years ago. And the more they studied, the farther back in time it went. And they called him the Iceman initially. Well, it turns out this was a fellow found in a little segment of the Alps called Otzels, so he's nicknamed Otzi. He's 5,600 years old. And the wonderful thing about this, Jim, is that he was found preserved with full kit, full all of his clothing, his medical supplies, his weapons, absolutely everything. So, as you know, from the Stone Age, we only see little arrowheads and shards of pottery. And this was one of the biggest archaeological, five biggest discoveries in the last century. So I was with an old buddy, Jay LeBeau, a retired case officer who lives in Innsbruck, and we had had a few beers and decided, hey, let's go see Otzi. So we jumped on a train and went up to about 2 hours up to Bolzano, Italy. They've got a little museum up there, and it's just awe-inspiring because Otzi feels very real, and he had basically the same brain that we do, and he responded to the same survival mechanisms that we do. Of course, he was more worried about being eaten by a bear than we are, but basically we carry the same head, same mind that he had today. And so it's an interesting way to look at our basically Stone Age mind in this modern age of meetings and emails and AI.
So along those lines, why are our brains wired for survival and there's little room for creative thought?
Well, that's a fascinating question too. I've surveyed a couple thousand people when I give talks, and I ask them the question, what percent of your day is spent in meetings and on email? And interestingly, whether they're IC people or civilians, or whether they're Germans or Canadians, everybody comes up with roughly the same answer of about 85% of their day. This is just their perception, but 85% of their day is spent meetings and emails. So that doesn't leave a lot of time left for reflection or building relationships, or even doing your job. And that creates a lot of stress. And so that stress hits our basically our primitive brain, and creates all kinds of unconscious workplace issues that we really should be more aware of. So Otzi, the survival mechanism was unconscious unless he saw somebody coming at him with a bow and arrow. But ours is too, and it operates exactly the same way with fear and reward. And we can get into that more later. But as that plays out in the workplace, it's really fascinating. Has a fascinating impact back on the spy master's question of why those levers don't work sometimes.
Mike, elaborate a little bit for the audience on the lazy, pre-programmed brain versus the focused brain.
This is a model that psychologists have come up with. It's fascinating. There was a book out, Jim, you may have heard of it maybe 10, 15 years ago, called Thinking Fast and Slow by a guy named Daniel Kahneman. And he was a world-class psychologist, and he studied cognitive biases that are kind of short. Think of these as shortcut methods that our brain operates in. And they keep us alive, obviously, through the ages, but sometimes they can get us in trouble. So he came up with the idea that we are more irrational, not meaning that we're crazy, but more irrational than we are rational. And psychologists started studying this in the 90s, that we tend to have these cognitive biases that really aren't rational, but they drive our behavior. So he wrote a book and ended up accomplishing something's unheard of. He won a Nobel Prize in economics as a psychologist. And back in my day, when I was a puppy, I studied economics with a book called written by Samuelson, and it was the rational man theory, man meaning man or woman. And he completely debunked that's not the way we make choices at all. So when I saw that got me thinking about the spy master's question. For example, he divides it into the fast brain and the slow brain. The fast brain is just this automatic habitual behavior, cognitive biases, emotions, all that stuff happens like that. But the slow brain, as he calls it, is when we have to stop and concentrate and think about things. And that uses up a lot more energy glucose, basically. So the brain keeps us operating usually in fast mode pretty quickly. So people, the viewers and listeners out there, if they're driving their car, they've driven a car so much they're an auto brain. However, if they come up to downtown DC and have to parallel park, suddenly they're going to turn down the radio, and that's the key, and they're going to focus and concentrate on that. So getting back to the spy master's question, the levers he was talking about are all very logical things to do. Yeah, if I just tell you what to do, I know Jim Hughes will go do it. But it doesn't work that way. And I'll give you one more quick example. If you look at anybody out there, think about watching a political argument in the last year where they saw two people having a political debate, and they're throwing facts back and forth at each other to convince the other, and neither convinces the other. Why is that? Well, the Atlantic Magazine just had an article last week that facts don't change beliefs. That it's that auto brain is pretty much what's in operation here, and so the facts, the logic is not going to change that. And you've seen the same thing if you had a friend who's going out with someone new, and you try to warn the friend, wait a minute, she's poison, or he's no good. You're not going to have much impact with logic, right? So whether it's love, or whether it's politics, or whether it's leadership, all that stuff is in that automatic brain, and that's where you got to meet them. And to meet them, it involves all these little things that we know and do, like even chit chat, or question asking, or active listening, all that stuff that you learn about in Leadership 101. But that's the key to get to that person on the other side.
Mike, why does bonding upstage logic and fear trump reward?
Well, it's funny, Jim. I was always kind of a lone wolf type person, and that's why I was selected for certain jobs I used to do back in the day at the agency. So you can imagine the agency does extensive psychological assessments and so forth, pick the right people for the right job. And that would tell you the fact that I had lone wolf type jobs quite early on in my career. It would tell you probably my empathy levels maybe are not quite as high as yours or somebody else's. And so, yeah, I think my entire life, I knew the social element was important. In other words, people's relationships. Even I can understand that. But I didn't have an appreciation for how important that is. And back to Otzi, when they discovered all of his tools and even his coat, they could tell that multiple people had sewn his coat because he had different stitching styles. They could tell that multiple people he had a little tiny copper axe, which was revolutionary, and scientists couldn't believe it when they found that thing. That pushed the Stone Age back about 1,000 years. So anyway, what I'm saying is he was dependent on other people to survive. And that's the way it's always been. None of us could survive without any other people. And I was flying into Moscow, and an old professor, my psychology professor from grad school, was flying out of Moscow, and we bumped into each other in Frankfurt airport. And it was fortuitous because I didn't realize it at the time, even when I had him in class. This guy was the world's leading expert on human drives. And he later published a book. I wouldn't recommend anybody go pick this up, but it was called Driven. And he and a fellow named Nitin Noria, who's the dean at Harvard Business School, wrote this book. They analyzed everything about human drives, and they got it down just 4 categories. And one of them, well, they were bonding, acquiring, defending, and learning, interestingly enough, which is distinctly human. So those 4 drives, and then it's much more complex because they interrelate and there's subdrives and all that. But what he told me one time, he said, Mike, don't ever forget that bonding of those 4 drives is first among equal. That's the one that's the most powerful. And so neuroscientists have been looking into this, see that this is the same thing is true, that the human relationships are extremely important to us. We've got little invisible antenna to pick up indicators that maybe not everything's right with our relationships or with our boss. So that bonding is so very important, and it really does overact the other. Now you mentioned reward too, but so let me just mention this, that if you think about this, which is more powerful, the threat, meaning, or the fear, or the reward when we talk survival? And I did something 25 years ago I'd recommend everybody do. We planted 20 fruit trees around our yard. Pat, my wife, and I did. And they're glorious to go out and pick fruit, throughout the summer and fall. But anyway, let's say I'm out there, I'm picking an apple, and the grass is tall, and I'm just reaching up for that luscious apple, and I hear a rustling in the grass. What is it? And immediate, probably listeners are thinking, well, it was a snake. So the question is, will I jump, or am I going to still go for the reward of the apple? And of course, what I'm going to do is jump back. It doesn't matter that it was a chipmunk. I assumed it was a snake. So what we know is threat is greater than reward. And that's a very important part when you go back to the workplace. And the reason is that's why you hear all the talk today about psychological safety in the workplace. If you're working for a really fearsome boss, you're not going to be as creative as you normally were. You're hunkered down. And we certainly see that in the workplace, in the government workplace today, because when that fear arises, no matter what those rewards are, we're gonna hunker down and favor the fear. And that's unconscious, but that's just the way the mind works.
Mike, what does it take to master habits? And does it take very long?
Well, this was an interesting side trip I took, Jim, on my Spy Master's question, because one thing is, okay, so why do we resist change? And I'll give you an example. I was walking down the 7th floor with a CI director, and he turned to me and he said, Mike, why is it they aren't being more innovative? And I knew what he meant by that was that because he was really into more innovation in the agency. And I knew what he meant was that he wasn't getting his message across, and the culture was pushing against him and so on. But then he said, I've told them in my first 5 speeches, I want more creativity. And so, how do you answer CI director that asks you a question like that? Because, on the one hand, it's a naive question. On the other hand, it's a pretty cosmic question of why can't you just tell people what you want them to do and they'll do it? And so part of the answer is all of that. The unconscious things are pulling us back. Is the reward system geared for you to be more creative? Or are you working for a boss who's kind of mediocre and flares up sometime, and therefore you're not about to be more creative or try something new? So that's part of the answer. The other part, though, is culture. And someday I hope we can talk about that. I've got a lot of data on the IC culture, which is absolutely fascinating. But the culture pushes back. And all culture is basically the way we do things around here. It's just shared behaviors. And so that culture slows us down from acting to what the director says. Fear of maybe a bad boss slows us down. But the other thing is just habit. So if you told me to do something, I work for you, and you come down and say, hey, I want you to do check-ins. I want you to check in each week with each employee. It's only a 5-minute little informal meeting. Ask them how they're doing, get an update, and move on. Unless you have some kind of accountability in there, or unless you follow up, I'm probably not going to do it. And the reason is it's my just habitual behavior. So habit became part of this Spy Master's question formula. And so I started studying it, and I read the books on atomic habits, and Charles Duhigg's works. And frankly, when you take all the literature and findings on habit, it's not very reassuring that you and I are going to end up in the gym this week if we haven't been going to the gym. It's not not very assuring that we're going to completely change our diet and revolutionize ourselves. Because this habit really sticks. So the best we know is you can take small steps. Tiny steps help get you from A to B, and you can perfect that. But what's going on inside our heads? Why is that so hard why is it so hard to change habit? This is where it gets really odd. But if you do something several times, and there's no set number, after a period of time, it's as if your concentrating your logical brain writes software for that action, whether it's brushing your teeth, driving a car, or whatever. And it throws it back into that auto brain to take care of using much less energy than it was when you had to concentrate on the action. So how does it do that? They don't know. But anyway, think of it as just a little software package that goes in. So now it's in your auto brain and you do this every day, and now you want to change the habit. Well, what happens is, again, because of this survival mechanism, which is unconscious, you're starting to change a habit and your brain is saying to you, well, wait just a minute. It could be dangerous if you change that habit. I mean, you've been brushing your teeth this way for, 40 years. And if you change it, you never died when you brushed your teeth this way. Maybe you could die. I mean, it's totally illogical, but it is just reacting to something you did, which was always safe. And it's just saying, just watch out before you change. And so it sends out a little error message, which is a very tiny ping. And sometimes it's unnoticeable. Sometimes you can actually feel it. And so I'll do an experiment when I'm in a classroom. If you've been in a classroom, you've seen this. After 2 or 3 days, everybody sits in the same seat when they come in. And so I'll tell them, in 3 minutes, I'm going to ask you to do something. And if you can describe the emotion you experienced when I ask you to do this action, then you won't have to do the action. And everybody's puzzled and they're listening. And I say, okay, well, here's the action. In 3 minutes, I'm going to ask everybody to change their seats and pick up your stuff and move to a different. And then you hear it, the groans. Oh, no. Well, in 2 days, habitually, people get used to sitting in their seat. And they want to guard that seat and so on. But that's a great example of that little error message coming in our heads that sends out this little jolt of discomfort, and that tends to keep us doing what we've been doing. So I did an experiment, by the way. I'll tell you about this one. I mentioned this thing called check-ins, which is a very powerful tool that bosses can use. And you remember back in our day, better bosses and did this. They would tend to circulate around, chat people up informally, casually. It wasn't, any kind of official uptight thing. Very, very comfortable, and just ask them how they were doing, or what the boss could do to help them, or how you could even go into questions like, what did you do this week that you're proudest of? That's a neat question, because you're going to get something back from them you didn't even know about, and you can praise them. But anyway, good bosses did these little quick hit check-ins, usually not in their office. Usually it's in the cubicle or walking around. So what we did, I just designed a new leadership course for CISA, which is the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency over in DHS. And what we did, it's designed like LOTL, we called it, Leadership on the Line, which was our CIA course. But this one is a little more intense and updated since the time we did that one. But we put in the requirement and we taught them how to do check-ins. And again, the habitual behavior, even if they practiced it in class, that's going to get in the way. So we added some accountability, very simple way, which is for each week, send in a report to your boss, very simple, 5 bullets. What did I learn doing a check-in about myself this week? And what did I learn about my employees when I did check-ins? Very short report. And then after 90 days, it's evergreen, you kill the report. So you're not creating bureaucracy with yet
Right.
another report. But what that does is you have had them practice this, I call it habitual process, and you've had them practice that for 90 days, and suddenly then and it looks like it's working. It looks like people are actually doing it. That solves a big problem in the leadership development and training business, by the way, Jim, which was we give them state of the art training, and this is true private public sector, and then people don't practice it. So there's been some criticism, but this is a way to get around that: is use that power of habit, just know how to dial it down or dial it up to make sure those behaviors carry over.
Mike, what is the significance of trust in relationships? And is it two-way?
Oh, that's a great question. First off, let me tell you something we did when we were looking at building Lotl. We started figuring out, okay, we wanted to ask, okay, what is good leadership? So we put together an 8,000 boss study where we'd get employees would rank or list all of the bosses they'd ever had. I didn't want to see the names, but they would list them, and then they would rank those bosses as great, good, poor, awful, or average. And then all I did was collect the data on those bosses. And so we got the ones that had great bosses. We wanted to know, why were the bosses great? So I went back first, and we've got a list of descriptors. And I've got about 60 or 70 I could send you of great bosses, but they're really unhelpful because they're just platitudinal. They're correct, but they're not actionable, like have integrity and be trustworthy and so on. So what we wanted to know is, okay, what are those specific behaviors of the great boss? And then we collected those by asking people, tell me a story about your best boss. And when they did that, inevitably they would be describing some behavior that boss did. And we were able to take those behaviors and then clump them together. So this is where it gets interesting. We found that there's sort of a stair step related to leadership, where first you're going to build, we called it safety. We should have called it psychological safety, but it was just the simplest things that a good boss will do. Say hello in the morning, smile at people, pretty basic stuff, but build that psychological safety. Then they can build trust, because you don't trust somebody you're fearful of. You can respect them possibly, but it's hard to really build that trust bond when fear is there. And then after trust, we found that they had real clarity in their communications, because you have somebody they feel psychologically safe, they trust you, and so that's where the trust fits in. But here's a story for you. I don't know if you ever knew Rob Johnston. He was a anthropologist that worked for the agency. But we were sitting in the Vienna Inn one time, and I'm waxing eloquently about leadership and saying, trust is the foundation for leadership. And Rob, who's the nicest guy in the world, but he looked at me and said, "No, Mike, you're wrong." And I said, "Why?" And he said, it's not trust, it's the law of reciprocity." And I said, "Rob, what do you mean?" And he said, in psychology and in anthropology, they have the law of reciprocity. And so in anthropology, it would be one tribe trades beads for another tribe, and the other tribe gives them seashells back. And it's not the fact that it's a gift, but it's the fact that it's a consistent transaction. It goes back and forth between the two, and that builds trust. So he said, for people, it's the same thing. And so I went back and started studying, and it's fascinating the way you build trust with people. The simple answer is you give them gifts. And the gifts don't cost you anything, but it could be your time. They could be praise. It could be, some people like data and information. It could be periodically give them that. I mean, there's a whole gamut, even opportunity and so forth. So there's this whole gamut of things that great bosses do to build that trust. And oh my gosh, is it true what you said, which it goes both ways. The really great bosses at CIA that we found were trusting, and trustworthy. And when I mean trusting, they would delegate, not just dumping, but delegate important things to somebody. That's a sign, you trust them. They would listen to them intently. And I've always had a problem with this, but they would listen to other people and lock into what they're saying. And that's a gift that you're giving somebody. So isn't it interesting that the best bosses, the kind of the gifts are flowing both ways, and that they are trusting and trustworthy.
Mike, if you would, discuss prompts and how effective they are in changing performance.
Well, what I did in the book, I got part 3 is sort of the solutions to the spy master's questions, and I call these things prompts, just not to confuse people with something you'll read in literature today called nudges, and that comes from Kahneman's work and others, where you can nudge people. Daniel Pink is another writer in that area, but you can nudge people to make choices. Well, I wasn't interested in choices. I'm more interested in behaviors of bosses and behaviors of the employees. So I came up with a whole series of these prompts. Now, to keep it short, I'll just tell you a very simple one, and I'll tell you a very complicated one. First off, there's one, I call it the vision prompt. And what that is, if you think about the human mind, you've got the visual cortex. So sight is very, very important mechanism for getting data and inputs into our brain. And in fact, that whole area for sight is larger than all other senses combined. And it's interesting. They did an experiment just last year on if you see something and all your other senses tell you that's wrong, you almost always will go with sight. That's how predominant that is. So that also explains how we have a lot of differences. Like you and I watched Judy go up to the copier as she rushes off, and then I go up to the copier and I find it jammed. Well, remember me, I'm lower in empathy, so my assumption is, well, Judy, boy, she's just not a team player. I don't like Judy because she left it jammed. You watched her and said, "Oh, that's nice that Judy ran off to get help to get the copier fixed." But see how we can see the same thing, and we have different narratives in our head. Which brings me to the second part, was when you add the brain sight ability with the visioning, the storytelling ability of the brain, you add those two areas together, and you're taking up as much territory as China on a map of Asia. Because it's a very powerful mechanism. So good bosses, I call it the vision prompt. Good bosses should obviously use pictures if they're trying to sell something, infographics, graphically display data, use storytelling, use metaphors, use anything that's more engaging than that director I talked about who just gave a speech and told people to be more creative. If he might have made some converts if he'd woven storytelling and so forth in there. But anyway, that's one of the simpler prompts that can aid you if you're leading people, leading a team. Now I'll tell you about the one that's sort of complicated, and it sounds a little eerie, and you're going to think I'm talking about voodoo when I tell you how the brain operates when it comes to insight. Insight, the aha when you have a moment. And there were two chaps, neuroscientists, who were at Drexel at the time, and they were arguing or debating about what is insight. Is it fast analytical thinking, which is what psychologists thought a few years back, or is it something altogether different? And they opted for it's got to be something different. And they put huge numbers of different types of brain scanning equipment to discover this. But what they did, brought subjects in, and they would induce them to have insights. And it was largely through word type puzzles. And this is what they discovered. This is where it starts to get a little strange. It's not in the prefrontal cortex. It's a tiny area just above your right ear, less than the size of a dime. And literally, when you have an insight, there's an explosion of energy that occurs. that that explosion is, think about the cartoons you see when the cartoon character has an idea, the light bulb goes off. It literally, there's a light bulb in your head that goes off. But what happens is instantaneously new neuron connections are made when that explosion occurs. And one of the co-discoverers of the insight mechanism is a guy named John Cunhos, who I pull into the book because I learned so much from him. I asked him the question. I said, John, have you studied the brain chemicals that occur when someone has an insight? And he said, yes, that's where it really gets interesting. He said that we have 30 some chemicals sloshing around in our head, dopamine and so on. And he said, what happens at the instant of the insight, they combine in a way that gives you a sense of certainty, complete certainty. So back to this fear of change and survival and Otzi, what that means is if you have in a moment, you see the light, you have buy-in to the new idea or new vision or whatever it is, and that helps you break all these bonds of the cognitive biases and the habitual behavior and all the rest because you are totally bought into what you had an insight on. And it could be as simple as you doing your crossword puzzles or Sudoku and you get the little, it feels good, little jolt of, and you fill in the answer with your pen. Or it could be, my gosh, this is the person I'm going to marry. So they're little and they're big. So I tried to figure out a way could we harness those in the workplace? And this is, now we go back to our problem. Remember our 85% rule. People, what happens is you have to be in a reflective mood for the insight to occur. And that's literally like Newton walking through an orchard. He's calm. He's got alpha wave frequency in his brain. And then when that insight occurs, they don't know why, the frequency goes higher and it triggers the insight. But you have to be in a reflective mood. And that's not what you see in a modern workplace anywhere, whether it's private sector, public sector, or the intelligence community. So how can you get people to have insights that help them accept change and move on? So this is the last little story I'll tell you real quickly. What I did is I found a group at the State Department. This was about 1,000 people in this group, and they had a terrible boss. They were 30% under strength because a lot of good people burned off to get away from the bad boss. Morale was incredibly low. And are you ready for this? They had a 7-year backlog of business. I've never heard of anything like that. So what a perfect laboratory to try this concept of the insight prompt. So what we did is the new boss coming in was just a stellar 8%er, I call them, people in the top 8%, and you were one of the leadership spectrum. These are people you really want to work for. So he was coming in, and what I did was just designed a way where he would go to his 20 managers below and tell them, look, I want you to think about any way that we could improve our culture here or make work-life balance better or do our mission more easily. I just want you to think about that. And in 60 days, come back. And I'm going to, we'll have a panel. This will be, it's all going to be positive. Don't worry, no gotchas. But there'll be a panel. It'll be me and my boss sitting in there, and you come in and make a presentation. Tell us what you've thought of. Well, the reason I did that was, this is what I learned at CIA, which was, remember the director who said, be more creative, and then nothing happens. Well, here's a real quick story for you on Leon Panetta. And you remember when we were hunting bin Laden, that stretched out for a long period of time. And Panetta had the 5 o'clock bin Laden meeting. It was called every Wednesday. So they were sitting in there, and he turns to this hapless case officer and he says to him, so what new ideas have you got to catch bin Laden? And the officer said, Chief, I'm sorry, I'm out of ideas totally. And the whole group is. So Panetta flared up, and then he did what good leaders do. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not mad at you. It's just the situation. He said, let's do this. Let's adjourn the meeting and you come back in for next week's meeting and bring me 10 new ideas to catch bin Laden. So what happened? Well, people probably were thinking about that on the job because it's the director, but they were also thinking about it when they're driving home. Remember in that alpha wave state, or they're in the shower, or they're jogging. They're thinking about bin Laden, and sometimes they're not thinking about bin Laden, and that's the moment the insight would occur. So they came back the next week, and they had 37 new ideas to catch bin Laden. And so that's what I call an insight prompt, where you give somebody mental homework, give them a chance to long period of time to think about it, so there doesn't have to be on the job, it's not immediate, and then there's accountability at the end of a report out or a meeting or a report or something. So back to the State Department group. They came in, and I was expecting 20% good ideas because this group had been beaten down so much. What they actually came up with, and this is rough numbers because I'm going on my memory here, but we had something like 40% good ideas. That delighted me. But we also had another 40% of ideas that were out of the box. I mean, world changing. And then 20% of the folks, 20 to maybe almost up to 30, just came up with the regular stuff of, well, this is what we've done last week and this is what we did the week before. But wisely, what the boss said was, well, let's adopt them all. And he said, we're gonna do a matrix here of which ones have the highest impact, which have the lowest impact, which are easiest to implement, and which are the hardest to implement. And the group jointly agreed. They rated them, ranked them, and so that's how he could approve all. They're just starting at the top with the easy ones with the highest impact. And I mean to tell you that talking about a quick turnaround in morale, culture, and everything all came from this little mental exercise of letting people get this rush of certainty about their solution, to the trust building where you're asking them to come up with an idea. That's a gift that you've given them. So you get all those things together, and that's the insight prompt. Mental homework, time to think about it, and the accountability having to report out.
Well, the name of the book is Certainty. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I said to Mike off camera, I really wish I'd had access to it 20 years ago.
I do too, Jim.
And I want to thank Mike Mears for really a fascinating presentation.
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you so much.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.